Okay, let's go.
Okay, so I don't want to take more of the time, but I'm very excited today to have this talk, especially because I just came off of a conference called JPro 25, which was a lot of the federations and a lot of different Jewish organizations from around the world, and the amount of people who didn't know that World War II even affected the Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, and these are all Jewish professionals, was a bit astounding. So we think talks like this are extremely important, and we will continue to promote them and encourage them. And we thank you for those who are here for helping us to promote this. And please do share when you get the link so that we continue to. And we are really proud to welcome back Professor Reeva Spector Simon. So thank you. I'm going to give a one sentence just so that we at least respect you. Um, so um, Professor Spector Simon has served as Associate Director of the Middle East Institute, Columbia University, and Professor of History at Yeshiva University. She is the author of Iraq Between the Two World Wars, Spies and Holy Wars, and co-editor of The Jews of the Middle East and North Africa in Modern Times. Among many other accomplishments, like I said, that was one sentence, and I look forward to handing the floor over to you. So hopefully this will be smooth from here on out. I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments, please do put them in there and continue to tell us where you're signing in from and any reactions. Thank you.
Okay, I would just add that my recent book, The Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, The Impact of World War II, deals directly with this subject.
Right, and
Okay,
we have spoken about that one before.
yes, we've spoken about that. Okay, now how do I do the slides?
On the bottom, do share. They're open already, right?
Yes. Okay, chat share. You send request. Send. Now what? What do I do now?
Okay. You should be able to share.
Meaning, okay, I mean, did I just cut you off?
No?
Okay.
It should
Uh,
be a green around the window when you open it. So try
okay,
share again. We don't
okay, I
see
don't
your slides.
see you at all now. All I
You
see
don't
is
need
my,
to see me. I'm going to go blank anyway. But
okay.
but we don't see
Send,
your slides yet, Reva.
you don't. Oh,
No.
great.
So
Okay,
go
so
into share again.
wait a minute. What did I do here? I think I lost you. Oh, no, I couldn't
No,
have.
we
Okay.
still see you and hear you.
You see me and hear me. So, okay, so I go back to Zoom. Okay,
Mhm.
and I go back to, sorry, but I'm, technologically, okay, so, um,
Click on share and then it should open up the windows.
oh, okay, and Keynote over here, and I press that.
Yep.
Okay,
There we go. If you want to go into presentation mode, oh, play, there you go. And I will
okay,
go to silent now.
okay, that's fine. Thank you, Dora. Uh, and folks at the Jewish Unity through Diversity Program for giving me the opportunity to speak about the impact of World War II on the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. The questions I always ask at the beginning of these talks are the following. Did you know that Egyptian Jews boycotted German products in the 1930s? That Mein Kampf was serialized in Arabic newspapers? Cities in the Middle East and North Africa, including Tel Aviv and Haifa, were bombed. 180 Iraqi Jews died in an attack on the Baghdad Jewish community in 1941. Algerian Jews helped the Allies in the invasion of North Africa, or that Jews in Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Morocco helped European refugees. Most people don't know these facts, or even that the war affected Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, even though that obviously it's clear that the Holocaust resulted in the slaughter of European, not Middle Eastern Jews. But while it is true that the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa weren't annihilated, but remember that Jewish communities in the Balkans, in Greece and Rhodes were wiped out. There is a story to tell about Jews in the region, Jews who lived in countries from Morocco to Iran. They were involved in the war, and World War II had impact on their lives. In short, there were bombings and invasions, anti-Semitic regulations, forced labor and deportations, attacks on Jewish communities, and the impoverishment of communities. Yet, despite it all, local Jews worked with the Allies and provided assistance to refugees from Nazi Europe. So what I'm going to do is divide this talk into three parts. I'm going to give some background on the folks living in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm going to talk a little bit about the war, and then I'm going to be more specific on how it affected the Jews in the region. From the 7th through the end of the 19th century, Jews in the Middle East and North Africa.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt for one moment. Did you mean to go to the next slide? Because we see the opening slide.
What do you see?
The opening slide, ripple effect, World War II in the Middle East.
Yes. I'm on the third slide already.
I assumed so, so I just wanted to make sure.
Which means what? You
Just
didn't.
progress through the slide on your computer.
Okay. Do you see, did you know that?
Nope, I still see the same one. You click next, no?
I'm not clicking next, I'm clicking it on my computer. But
Right, or an arrow to go next.
an arrow, exactly.
Right.
But you're not getting it.
No.
Okay, so let's see. Your screen sharing is paused. What does that mean?
I don't know.
Zoom, annotate, video.
It might maybe take it out of presentation mode and just show it as if it's you're scrolling through it.
So how do I do that?
Should be escape or something. I don't use Keynote, so I don't know.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, we can do it. To do it this way, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. This we talked about. Okay. All right, let's see how it works. The main thing here is going to be, or will be the maps.
Right.
From the 7th through the end of the 19th century, Jews in the Middle East and North Africa were under Muslim rule. Muslims established a dominant subordinate relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. The situation began as an expedient measure by a Muslim minority that conquered the region to rule the non-Muslim, mainly Christian and Jewish majority. But gradually, the arrangement became part of Islam and is commonly known as the Pact of Omar. Non-Muslims were known as Dhimmi or Ahl al-Dhimma, people of the Pact. And as Dhimmi, Jews paid a special tax to the government called the jizya. They couldn't build new synagogues or practice Judaism publicly, did degrading or dirty work that Muslims wouldn't do, such as leather tanning, dyeing cloth, or working with money. Muslims were not allowed to charge interest. Wore special clothes or different colors than those worn by Muslims, so they could be identified as Jews, and they couldn't join the military. But, and this is very important, the community as a community was protected by the ruler. The Jewish community had autonomy and authority in matters of religion and personal status, such as marriage and divorce. And despite the struggles and the fights within the Islamic world, there was freedom of travel throughout, so that we find Jewish communities from Morocco to Central Asia. During the 19th century, the relationship between Jews and Muslims began to change. The Ottoman Empire and some regimes in North Africa enacted reforms granting Jews citizenship at a time when Europeans occupied and colonized more and more of the region. Given new opportunities, Jews studied European languages, engaged in trade with European countries, and later filled jobs in the new colonial administrations. Their move to the middle class was facilitated by a network of Jewish schools by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, headquartered in Paris, that included schools for girls. They taught the French curriculum, modern skills, and even provided a path to university studies in Europe. Western educated Jews became more westernized. Some had British, French, or Italian passports. Many moved out of the old Jewish quarters of Middle Eastern cities to new European suburbs that were being built. Jews from the countryside were attracted by jobs and economic opportunities, moved to the cities. Nevertheless, most Jews were poor. Many remained in the old Jewish quarters, and Jews often remained traditional in religious observance. Then, in 1914, World War I began, and after the war, the situation of Jews in the region changed again. The stage for World War II was set. Well, okay, we're missing the Eastern Mediterranean here. I don't know how to do this. All right, 1 second, let's do it this way.
Yeah, if you close the window on the right, there you go. That was beautiful.
Okay, thank you. First, the political map of the region changed after World War I. New states were created from defeated empires, and most of the region came under direct or indirect rule of the European powers. Okay, can you see this? Different map?
We're still on the North Africa and the Middle East map.
Okay, then we'll do it this way. And we'll do it this way. The French occupied Syria, Lebanon, Tunisia, and parts of Morocco. They had already made Algeria part of France. Italy occupied Libya. The British occupied and ruled either directly or indirectly Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan, and the Palestine Mandate. In the 1930s, control of Palestine became a political issue, especially during the Arab Revolt in Palestine, when the Arabs fought the British and the Jews. Now, instead of empires, the Middle East and North Africa was made up of countries that were either independent or European or quasi-independent, but each had its own defined borders, its own distinct political orientation, its own economic policy, and its own foreign policy. The one policy that they all had in common was to get the colonial powers out of their countries. That meant get the British, the French, and the Italians to leave the Middle East and North Africa. Now, for Jews, this change initially led to optimism. From Morocco to Iran, secularly educated Jews came of age in the 1920s, identified as culturally Western, religiously Jewish, and nationally as citizens of the state where they lived. Algerian Jews were the exception because they were granted French citizenship in 1870. Muslims were not granted French citizenship. The post-World War I new states were supposed to adhere to League of Nations standards of human rights that meant citizenship and equality. Despite the changes in League of Nations guidelines, however, that really didn't happen. Jews could be citizens, but in truth, in these countries, Jews had become a minority of individuals that did not have the guaranteed protection by the government that the community as a whole had had before. Sure, there were designated Jewish seats in some parliaments, but generally, if Jews participated in politics at all, they were active behind the scenes. They contributed financially to political parties or wrote for newspapers, often under different names. Most people kept a low profile, and Jews were loyal to the regime in power, as they always had been. Yes, the political map changed. And during the 1930s, the nature of politics also began to change. The optimism of the 1920s receded. Peoples of the region began to assert new identities based on ethnic nationalism. Persians traced themselves to Indo-European origins and renamed the country Iran. Turks claimed their ancestors were Hittites or even Sumerians, as they too tried to create an Indo-European identity. They forced their citizens to speak Turkish, and Jews were cautioned not to speak Ladino in public. Arab nationalists, Pan-Arabs, wanted to unite Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and the countries of the Fertile Crescent, including the land of Israel. Although Arab nationalism began as a secular movement, it soon became quite clear that to be an Arab, you could be Muslim or Christian, but you couldn't be a Jew. Even though many Iraqi Jews, for example, were educated in government schools and considered themselves culturally Arab and had very little interest in Zionism. Despite pleas to be viewed as Jewish citizens of their various countries, the term Jew and Zionist began to blur as more Middle Eastern countries became independent and adopted support for the Palestinian Arabs in their foreign policies. At the same time in North Africa, French anti-Semitic political parties penetrated North Africa, especially in Algeria, which was politically part of mainland France. The French encouraged European settlers to settle there. These settlers were generally opposed to the 1870 Crémieux Decree that granted Jews French citizenship and viewed Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was accused of passing military secrets to Germany, as the symbol of the treacherous Jew. Throughout the 1930s, especially in Algeria, Jews found themselves caught between the French settler community that didn't consider Jews French and the Muslims who identified Jews with their colonial overlords. In addition, during the mid-1930s, Middle Eastern ethnic nationalism became tinged with anti-Semitism. European anti-Semitic literature appeared in the Middle East, where there were already residues of Western-style Christian anti-Semitism. The Damascus Blood Libel of 1840, for example. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was translated into Arabic by a Lebanese Christian priest in 1925. Mein Kampf was serialized in Arabic newspapers in Iraq and North Africa. Some even admired Mein Kampf as a useful plan of action. The problem was that the Arabs were Semites, and in the Nazi racial hierarchy, they were located just a rung above the Jews. The Nazis had to find a way to reconcile a pragmatic political policy in the Middle East with their own racial ideology. So German diplomats in the region advised that anti-Semitism be changed to anti-Judaism in Arabic translations of Mein Kampf. Bosnian Muslims were classified as Islamo-Germans, and the Mufti of Jerusalem, Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, was declared to be an Aryan. After all, he had fair skin, reddish hair, and blue eyes. This was very important to the Nazis in 1936, that Arabs and Muslims could attend and participate in the Olympic Games held in Germany. But unlike Mussolini, who advocated organizing Italian expats who lived in Egypt and Libya, organizing them to the fascist cause, Hitler didn't get involved in the Middle East until the late 1930s. He hoped all along for an alliance with Britain and didn't think that the inferior peoples of Asia and Africa could throw off the yoke of the racially superior Anglo-Saxons. Nevertheless, by 1938, there were Nazi party cells that could serve as effective German fifth columns in Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, Iran, Afghanistan, Tunisia, Turkey, and Palestine. Now, despite the Nazi presence in the Middle East, Jews in the region were among the first to take action against the Nazis. In 1933, Egyptian Jews formed the International League Against Racism and Anti-Semitism and boycotted German goods. The boycott spread throughout communities in the Middle East and North Africa. German officials launched a counter-campaign and lawsuits, and the British, fearing possible disorders and financial repercussions, intervened to halt the boycott and to quiet the most vocal aspects of the campaigns on both sides. Nevertheless, the boycott continued unofficially on an individual level. Okay, when World War II broke out in 1939, it didn't seem that the Middle East and North Africa would be affected by what was essentially a European conflict. The Allies, Britain and France, controlled the Mediterranean. Britain, with its Middle East headquarters in Egypt, was dominant in the Eastern Mediterranean, where her main concerns were control of the Suez Canal and to keep the oil from the Persian Gulf flowing. The French fleet was stationed in the Western Mediterranean, and France, as you can see, occupied most of North Africa. But the Nazi blitzkrieg resulted in the French surrender in June of 1940, and that changed everything and brought the region directly into the war. Because the armistice that was signed divided France in two. Germany occupied the area in the north, and in the south, there was a French-controlled government located at Vichy. France's overseas territories and colonies in the Middle East, Syria, and most of North Africa. These were placed under the jurisdiction of Vichy. What that meant was that Britain now stood alone, not only in Europe, but also in the Mediterranean, and that the anti-Semitic regulations imposed on Jews in Europe were now extended to Jews in French overseas possessions. Now, strategically, Germany and Italy sort of divided up military responsibility for the Middle East and North Africa. Hitler initially, Hitler was concerned primarily with expansion in Europe, and he left the Middle East to Mussolini. But Mussolini was over energetic and jumped the gun, and he was eager to invade Egypt from Libya, which he did, and attack British forces in September of 1940, but failed. As the British pushed Italian forces back to Libya, and it was clear that the Italians were no match for the British, Hitler sent General Erwin Rommel and German troops to North Africa, which fought a back and forth war with the British across Libya that lasted until late 1942. So you had major conflict in North Africa, back and forth across Libya. In addition, situation was precarious in the spring of 1941, when German armies occupied Greece and the Balkans. The German army was at the border of Egypt. Bombs were falling on Egypt and Palestine, and a pro-Nazi regime was in control of Iraq. In the streets of Syrian cities, there was a popular verse going around. No more, no more monsieur, no more mister. God in heaven, on earth, Hitler. By the end of the summer of 41, however, British forces had defeated the Iraqis in a short war and invaded Syria. Russian and British troops occupied Iran. But as the war in North Africa continued, in May of 1942, the Germans reached El Alamein, some 70 miles from Alexandria. But by that time, the United States had entered the war, and plans were being made for an Allied landing in North Africa on the way to an Allied invasion in Europe. The successful landing on November 8, 1942, Operation Torch, led the way to Allied victories in Tunisia, and by January of 43, military operations in the Middle East ended. We should note that in 1939, none of the independent countries in the region that had Jewish populations declared war on Germany or Italy. So that, in short, that's the outline of the war. For Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, the worst period was between 1940 and 43. Overall, Jews, like the rest of the population, suffered from the general impact of war, shortages in food rationing, economic hardship, and general deprivation. There were about, let's see, there were about 1 million Jews in the region. But there was more, as I mentioned: bombings and invasions, anti-Semitic regulations, forced labor and deportations, attacks on Jewish communities, and impoverishment of communities. Communities in the war zone were bombed. Between 1940 and 42, Libya was occupied and reoccupied by British and Italian troops. Tripoli and Benghazi were bombed repeatedly. Jews found refuge in underground shelters and in neighboring Libyan Arab villages. As troops moved east, Egypt became the target of Axis bombing raids as the Italians bombed Egypt. During the summer of 1941, some 90,000 people fled Alexandria for Cairo as hospitals and the main waterworks of the city were bombed, flooding a good part of the city. Some 35,000 people also left Cairo when German troops, commanded by Rommel, reached El Alamein, some 70 miles from Alexandria. In June and July of 1941, some 42 planes bombed Haifa and Acre. In one raid, Italian planes dropped nearly 4 tons of bombs on Tel Aviv, an open city that did not have an early warning system and didn't have anti-aircraft guns. 125 people died, 117 Jews, 7 Arabs, and 1 Australian soldier, and there was extensive property damage. The British refused to provide anti-aircraft guns. They said that they didn't have them to defend London, which was also being bombed during the Blitz. Now, British planners in Cairo considered worst-case scenarios and thought about moving troops first to Palestine and then to India, but there were no plans to evacuate Jewish civilians. Jews in Palestine were worried about a Nazi invasion and an Arab attack, and they were worried about their relatives in Europe as news of the Holocaust reached them. There were stories of people walking around Jerusalem with cyanide capsules. Leaders of the Jewish community even drew up plans for a Masada-like last stand at Mount Carmel. Jews were subject to anti-Semitic regulations. Beginning in 1940 and until 43-44, the anti-Jewish laws in France affected Jews in Syria, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Jews in Algeria, which was politically part of mainland France, lost their citizenship even if they had fought for France during World War I and achieved medals of valor. Syria, Tunisia, and parts of Morocco were French overseas territories that were assigned by the 1940 armistice agreement to the pro-Nazi regime in Vichy. The Vichy government imposed anti-Semitic regulations on Jews in these countries. For example, Jews could not be a banker, money changer, agent for stocks or loans, sports commissioner, journalist, except for religious or scientific periodicals, theatrical director, entertainment impresario. There were quotas on the numbers of Jews who could attend schools or enter the professions, such as law and medicine. The problem was that quotas on the number of Jewish doctors affected everybody because the health sector in these countries was dominated by Jews, especially European immigrants, so that the general health of the population was endangered. In Morocco, Jews had to live in the Mellah, the old Jewish quarter, a situation that led to overcrowding and health hazards. Generally, Jews received less than half the food rations non-Jewish Europeans received. And to the surprise of many, there were internment camps in North Africa. Thousands of Jews were sent to internment camps that were worked as forced laborers in North Africa. Now, during the late 1930s, internment camps were set up in southern France and the Spanish border for political prisoners and thousands of refugees fleeing the Nazis from Germany and Austria. When France capitulated to the Nazis, camps were also set up in Morocco and Algeria to intern primarily European Jews. These included demobilized Jewish soldiers who had volunteered to serve in the French army. Algerian Jewish political prisoners, refugees taken off passenger ships, and people who had managed to find shelter in Algeria. Jews from camps in southern France who had been grabbed in raids during mass deportations of foreign Jews in August of 1942 were sent to labor camps as, quote, volunteers in areas under French control in Algeria and Morocco. Now, there's no record of many of the internees because men who were stateless were, as a result, invisible to foreign relief organizations. Men were also sent to work on the Trans-Saharan Railroad, a French plan to link Algeria and sub-Saharan Africa. Men had to lay track across more than 1,000 miles of desert in areas of strong winds and little water, in daytime temperatures reaching 125 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by bitterly cold nights. In these camps in Algeria and Morocco, men were herded into crowded camps consisting of barracks and tents with little to no protection from the heat and cold. The camps were often run by anti-Semitic former legionnaires and local Arabs who tortured prisoners for the smallest infraction. A former internee met Sophie Freud, the granddaughter of Sigmund Freud, while both were in Casablanca waiting for a visa to the United States. He told her that when he did not want to report for work on Rosh Hashanah, his punishment was to spend 8 days in a ditch with bread and water and was beaten by Arab guards. Similar camps were set up in Tunisia late in 1942 when the Germans assumed control. There, Jewish communities had to recruit local Jews sent to repair coastal roads during air bombardments by both Axis and Allied forces. The Germans proposed building extermination camps in Tunisia, but they didn't have time to implement their plans. The Italians established internment camps in Libya. The most notorious was the Giado camp near Tripoli, where men, women, and children were sent. Some 562 people died of typhus. Some Jews were also deported to Italy and later on sent to death camps. In Turkey, there were labor camps in eastern Turkey, where Jews who were conscripted into the Turkish army were sent. They weren't allowed to bear arms or serve with Muslims, but they were sent to labor camps. They were also sent to these camps when they could not or would not pay the exorbitant wealth tax the Turkish government imposed on them. And I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Jewish communities were attacked. The most notorious attack on a Jewish community was the attack on the Baghdad Jewish community. In June of 1941, known as the Farhud. Iraqi Jews were shocked because they were the most Arabized Jews in the Middle East and had never experienced such an attack. And it occurred when the Iraqis lost a short war against the British forces, which by treaty had military bases in Iraq. The Iraqi government, backed by pan-Arab nationalist military officers and the Mufti of Jerusalem, who had found sanctuary in Baghdad after fleeing the British in Palestine, negotiated with Berlin for support for the war, but didn't get it in time. So they lost, and the retreating soldiers moved towards Baghdad. Mobs in the city attacked Jews on June 1st and 2nd, which happened to be the holiday of Shavuot. The attack, or Farhud, violent dispossession, as it is called in Arabic, resulted in the death of some 180 Jews. Some 500 businesses were looted, and more than 900 buildings housing more than 12,000 people were pillaged. Some Jews fled to Iran, and some went to India, but few could enter Palestine because of the restrictions of the British White Paper. By the end of the summer, calm was restored. Nevertheless, the Farhud was a traumatic event for the community and has had a lasting impact. Communities were impoverished. The Turkish government imposed onerous conditions on the local Jewish community. There was forced conscription in 1940, and shortly thereafter, the government imposed an exorbitant wealth tax, the barlik, that impoverished the Jewish community. It was supposed to tax the wealthy, but hit the poor also. For example, a man who returned to Istanbul from serving in the Turkish military and began to work as a tutor, barely making a living, was double taxed as a big capitalist because his address could be both Istanbul, Asia, and Istanbul, Europe. People could appeal, but few of the appeals were addressed. Those who couldn't pay the tax by the deadline had their property confiscated and were sent to labor camps in eastern Turkey. Families left behind had no financial support, and confiscated property was owned by Turks and never returned. Tunisia, until late 1942, when the Germans took over, policy regarding Jews was made and implemented by the Vichy French and the Italians. When the Germans were there, they were ordered to hold Tunisia at all costs, and they brought in the SS and began, as I said, plans for the extermination of the Jewish population. Germans sent Jews to labor camps, also to repair bombed out roads, extorted money, and imposed exorbitant fines that bankrupted the community as the Allies approached. And as the Allies approached, they stole anything they could use. Jews endured the hardships of war. At the same time, local Jews worked with the Allies and assisted Jews fleeing from Nazi Europe. Jews in Palestine worked with the British despite British policy restricting Jewish immigration. With British troops stretched thin, almost 20,000 Jews served in the local police force. By the end of the war, some 30,000 Palestinian Jews served in the British Army, even though the British were reluctant to draft Jews into the army. They were worried about what would happen after the war. It wasn't until 1944 that the British authorized the formation of the Jewish Brigade. The British also used Jewish assets for reconnaissance and sabotage in Syria. They used Arabic-speaking Jews from the Middle East and local Syrian Jews who were trained to absorb Arab customs, including singing, dancing, and backgammon, so that they could melt into the local milieu. The Spies laid the groundwork for the British invasion of Syria in June 1941, where, as you know, Moshe Dayan lost his eye. Jews also helped the Allies in Operation Torch. On November 8, 1942, an Anglo-American force commanded by General Dwight David Eisenhower landed in North Africa. Known as Operation Torch, the invasion was the first major step in the Allies' plan to retake Europe from the Nazis. They were going to move from Algeria to Italy and on to the rest of Europe. A group of 377 poorly armed Jewish volunteers, led by Henri Abouker, was instrumental in holding strategic points in Algiers until the Americans could enter the city. Unfortunately, American control didn't result in the immediate release of Jewish internees in labor camps or the abrogation of anti-Jewish Vichy regulations. The Allies didn't want problems with the Muslim population, and it took more than a year for the cancellation of the Vichy laws in North Africa. They wanted the status quo, and then they figured they'd worry about it later. So throughout the war years, local Jewish communities experienced anti-Semitic regulations. They suffered from discrimination, food shortages and rations, bombings, deprivation, and hardship. Despite dire local conditions, Middle East and North African Jews assisted European Jewish refugees who were escaping Nazi-occupied Europe. Let's look at 3 examples. Iran. In 1941-42, a large group of Polish Jews, including 871 children, escaped via the Soviet Union and entered Iran, which was on their way to Palestine. At the time, Iran was occupied by the British in the south and the Russians in the north, who had invaded the country in September of 1941. The Jewish refugees were among the more than 20,000 Polish soldiers and civilians fleeing the Nazi that Stalin allowed to transit through the Soviet Union. Of course, one of the best known of these Polish soldiers was Menachem Begin. In Iran, the impoverished Jewish community was already supporting Iraqi refugees from the Farhud. In addition, for more than a year, the local Tehran community was instrumental in providing food, clothing, medical care for the refugees, and saw to the education of the children until representatives of the Jewish Agency arrived to escort the children, now known as the Tehran children, to Palestine. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the escape route for Jewish refugees from Europe was through Turkey. It ran through the Black Sea into Turkey and onto Syria and then to Palestine. Turkey, which remained neutral throughout the war, was a center of espionage. They had German agents, British trying to set up escape lines for POWs, and later representatives of the Jewish Agency who worked to rescue Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe. Yes, it's true. In the 1930s, Turkey offered academic posts to German Jewish refugees, but it had a mixed record later with regard to Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis. It was an on-again, off-again policy that allowed or refused Jewish refugees to transit through Turkey unpermitted or declared it illegal for members of the local community to help, or even representatives of the Jewish Agency to help these Jews. Although the Jewish community was financially decimated by the Barlik attacks, the leaders of the Istanbul Jewish community formed a refugee rescue committee to house and feed Jews who had made it to Istanbul until they could make their way to Palestine. When the refugees reached Syria, Syrian Jews helped to smuggle them into Palestine. And of course, in the Western Mediterranean, Casablanca was the goal. It was one of the escape routes from Europe, from where tens of thousands of refugees reached Marseille and then on to North Africa with the hope of getting exit visas to continue on their journey to reach North or South America. When France fell, the number of refugees in Morocco increased dramatically. In Casablanca, a young Jewish attorney, Elaine Kazas Benatar, assisted the refugees. From the summer of 1940, when she helped refugees on a ship in Casablanca harbor that wasn't allowed to disembark, to the end of the war, Benatar was instrumental in aiding tens of thousands of European refugees. She intervened with civilian and military authorities, provided the necessary guarantees, and arranged for exit visas, housing, and medical treatment, often working in cooperation with international aid organizations, including the Joint Distribution Committee, HIAS, and later with the Quaker American Friends Service Committee. After Operation Torch, she worked with the Allied authorities to release internees from labor camps and to provide housing and jobs for them. By the end of 1943, the Allies had moved on to fight the Axis in Europe. Okay. What about Middle Eastern and North African Jews in Europe? There were approximately 30,000, predominantly Turkish and North African Jews, who were stranded in Europe during the war and used ingenious methods to evade capture by the Nazis, and some were rescued by Turkish, Iranian, and Moroccan Muslims. In Morocco and Tunisia, local rulers tried to alleviate the harsh conditions imposed on their Jewish subjects. Morocco was divided. Some were under Vichy control. Some were subjects of the Sultan of Morocco, so it was a complicated situation. Jewish soldiers in the British Army helped Jews in local communities and reconnected with Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. This reconnection had a major impact on these communities. So as we've seen, during the war, the Jews in the Middle East and North Africa experienced bombed cities, looting, starvation, attacks, murder, deportation, and forced labor. Throughout and wherever they could, local Jews assisted the Allied war effort and helped refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe. In 1945, Arab mobs attacked Jewish communities in Egypt, Libya, and Syria. Later, when American Jewish agencies and the Jewish Agency turned their attention to the, quote, forgotten million, they found impoverished communities facing an uncertain political future. I hope that this short survey has been helpful in providing an additional lens through which to view events in World War II, one where we see that Jews from Morocco and Iran were also, from Morocco to Iran, were also part of the World War II story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, there is so much more to tell, and I don't know if happy is the right word, but I'm encouraged to see that at least two of the things you mentioned, I've been hearing more on the streets, as it may be about the Farhud and about the Jado camp. So those who are looking for more information, there's plenty of information out there over that. Although some of the other places mentioned here are only available through Professor Spector Simon's materials at this. Well, I'm sure not only, but those are the ones that are most accessible. So I encourage you to read through it and to know the story, and note also um, that when you said it, Reeva, you said World War II and not the Holocaust.
Yeah,
Um,
specific, sure.
so I don't know if you want to give one sentence about that, just to.
Well, clearly, the Jews of the region were not decimated the way Jews in Europe were. So it would have to be World War II. If, Chas Khalila, the war had lasted longer, the Nazis had every intention of annihilating Jews from that region and Palestine from the mandate.
Yeah. I know that there was a lot given today, and I apologize again for the technical difficulties at the beginning. Thank you for those who stuck with us. I'm sure it was to your benefit for sure, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Please send in questions after. You'll get a follow-up email, and there's so much more to unpack and talk here. I look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wherever you are, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Reeva.
Thanks. You're welcome.